Okay, well, first off, I just want to say good evening and welcome to our fall community lecture here. So I'm very, very excited to have you all in our Manhattan campus tonight. Tonight happens to be one of my favorite nights of the year, when we get to gather, connect with one another, learn together, and gain a deeper understanding about a topic related to language-based learning disabilities and literacy. Windward is incredibly fortunate to have a partnership with researchers on the cutting edge of developments in neuroscience, largely thanks to the efforts of the Windward Institute. Since its inception, the Windward Institute has consistently and actively engaged with the most current research in order to translate that into practice and share it with educators through professional development offerings. The Institute also fosters connections with leading educational institutions that are advancing research in the field and advocates for better outcomes for students, but especially those with language-based learning disabilities. I would also add that the Windward Institute and its programs are made possible by the time, talents, and donations of many in our audience tonight, and for that we are truly grateful. I want to thank you all for your continued support and for being here, and to thank all those who are joining us virtually as well. Big round of applause for everybody being here tonight. Thank you. Windward is committed to advancing an understanding and advocacy around language-based learning disabilities. And our free community lectures, which we offer twice a year, play a central role in sharing that expertise with the wider community. Each fall and spring, we invite esteemed practitioners in the field of literacy to present on a topic relevant to the school's mission in the interest of informing, inspiring, and engaging our community in this important work. Tonight's lecture addresses a topic near and dear to my heart as a former school psychologist. Early in my career, I found myself drawn to the kids who needed additional support to help them thrive, who needed an advocate in their corner acknowledging the strengths and their capability for growth. And we have seen that at Windward, that reading challenges due to language-based learning disabilities often do not exist in isolation. They are intertwined with other issues such as anxiety and struggles around executive function. In order to fully prepare our students to return to mainstream educational settings, we know that it's critical to empower our students to grow, not only as learners, but as people. It is our responsibility to create an environment that's conducive to this growth, approaching opportunities for social and emotional learning with intention and evidence-based practices. This approach takes many forms, and it can help students understanding how to manage their emotions, cultivate positive coping skills, develop friendships, navigate social situations, and learn how to self-advocate. Our featured presenter tonight deeply understands the need to prioritize psychological wellness of children with learning disabilities. She has dedicated much of her research to exploring the ways in which psychological and neuropsychological factors both influence and are influenced by reading challenges. Dr. Amy Margolis is an associate professor of medical psychology at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She is also the director of its Environment, Brain, and Behavior Lab, as well as the Columbia Psychiatry and Public Health Collaborative Learning Disability Innovation Hub, funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. She holds a doctorate degree in applied educational psychology and school psychology from the Teachers College at Columbia University. Trained as a clinical neuropsychologist, she has more than 2 decades of experience addressing and treating students with learning and attentional disorders. Dr. Margolis seeks to use neuroimaging to inform the development of novel therapies for early prevention and programs for people with learning disabilities. She also studies how exposure to neurotoxic chemicals may affect neurodevelopment and manifest as subsequent learning and social problems. Dr. Margolis is a principal investigator on a number of federally funded projects, those that use neuroimaging, both MRI and EEG, and longitudinal birth cohorts to study the effects of prenatal exposure to neurotoxins and on brain and behavior outcomes. Her lab's research focuses on identifying neural correlates of environmentally associated reading and math problems in children living in the context of economic disadvantage. In addition, the lab studies environmentally associated phenotypes of attention, substance use, and thought problems. In a complementary line of research, the lab studies how disruptions in visual spatial processing impair children's functioning. And Dr. Margolis has established the prevalence and etiology and pathophysiology and treatment of nonverbal learning disabilities, or NVLD, which differentiates children with deficits in visual spatial reasoning from those with language-based learning problems. She actually published the first population estimate of MBLD, placing rates at 3% in North American youth, and the first functional MRI studies of MBLD, linking brain alterations and functional impairments in youth with MBLD. Her work has also shown that prenatal exposure to air pollutants and social stress associated with reduced hippocampal volumes in visual spatial processing, pointing to a possible etiologic pathway for MBLD. Dr. Margolis has published more than 60 papers, peer-reviewed papers, and is the author of 2 books on learning disorders, MBLD and Developmental Visual Spatial Disorder in Children, a clinical guide to assessment and treatment, and learning disorders across the lifespan, a mental health framework. Recently, she served as the text reviser for the chapter on specific learning disabilities in DSM-5. I'm still hanging on to 4 there. And as the co-chair of the Environmental Influencers on Children Health Outcomes, or ECHO, Neurodevelopmental Working Group. And finally, she actually serves as a member of the Windward Institute's advisory board. And Dr. Margolis lends her invaluable experience to help guide us in the path in the work that we do here at the Institute to shape the world of education from research, policy, to practice. This lecture will explore the ways in which psychological and neuropsychological factors, specifically anxiety and executive function problems, interact with reading challenges. The neural and behavioral underpinnings of this bidirectional relationship are well documented in science and can inform personalized approach to reading instruction. Specific interventions will be considered, along with the need to prioritize psychological wellness of children with language-based learning disabilities with much greater urgency. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Margolis for tonight's presentation, Psychological Components of Reading Disabilities, Novel Treat Interventions to Address Anxiety and Executive Function. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining tonight. How's my sound? We're all good? Okay. It's been my true honor. Thank you for the introduction, Jamie, and to Alexis for the invitation today. It's been an incredible day. I've been here since 9 this morning when I was greeted with coffee and interested, engaged faces of educators and colleagues and students and teachers, and it's just been, my brain is on fire from the day, thinking about all the things we've talked about, all the kids I got to see in the classrooms, and the incredible teachers, and this incredible space you all have built for kids with learning disabilities, which I guess from hearing my bio, you know is my passion about how we're going to do better for these kids. So I'm going to talk tonight about the psychology of learning disorders, anxiety, executive function, and personalized interventions. And the lecture was really inspired by some ideas in my recent edited volume. So the overarching thesis in this book is that specific learning disorders can be viewed within a mental health framework, and that there are clinical components of a specific learning disorder that might respond to psychological interventions quite separately from educational interventions. And I'm starting in the book from this premise that there's quite a gulf between education and medicine in our society, in our country, in our culture. And I think that this is particularly a problem for, I'm just going to call them our kids, the kids that we're all worried about with learning disabilities, because our kids are the ones who are going to fall right down there. And this gulf really, I think, stems, at least in part, we argue, from two underlying processes. And one is economic. So in our country, there are pretty strong factions thinking about economic policy, and health insurance reimbursement is driven by Medicare. They set the rules, and the Medicare rules have determined that a learning disability is an educational problem and is not a mental health problem. So if you have a learning disability, you're not entitled to psychotherapy. But if you have any other neurodevelopmental disorder like ADHD or autism or Tourette's or anxiety, you are entitled to psychotherapy. So that's one of our problems. And the other, I think, problem comes from this historical division between schools of education and schools of psychology. So even if like Teachers College houses programs for special education and school psychology, but they rarely talk to each other. So I actually was fortunate in my school psychology program to be forced to take courses in treating kids with reading problems in the reading intervention program. So we actually overlapped and took the same courses, which was why I wanted to go there. I didn't feel forced. But I think that is a real difficulty that we have, where if you go to school to learn to be a special educator or you go to school to learn to be a psychologist, you're rarely talking to each other. So most psychologists don't know how to treat a learning disability, and most teachers who train and do fantastic work learning how do I treat a learning disability don't know how to treat an anxiety disorder. So I'm starting from that premise, and I'd like to comment, as Jamie just pointed out, Windward is really an excellent exception to this rule of this divide, because Jamie is a school psychologist, and he calls himself a former school psychologist, but I think once a school psychologist, always a school psychologist. So this kind of interdisciplinary approach that we really need in order to overcome a lot of the challenges that I think are inherent in treating kids with learning disabilities if we can't bring these two fields together. Okay, so I'm going to talk today, I'm going to show you data from a bunch of 3 studies that examine the brain basis of anxiety and executive function problems in children with reading disorders. And then I'm going to talk about efforts being made to develop treatments that simultaneously address both the educational and the psychological. So for learning objectives, first, I'm hoping people will gain perspectives on multiple ways to define learning, anxiety, and executive function problems. So I'll throw in some definitions here and there. I hope you'll acquire some basic knowledge of brain circuits that are involved in anxiety, executive function, and reading disorders, and how these problems are interrelated. And then finally, describe ways that personalized treatments can address these interrelated problems. So I'm going to start by talking about anxiety. What are anxiety disorders? So just take a moment to think in your mind about students you've had in class or family members or friends. What do they do that make you think, oh, they're anxious? So here are some cartoons. Here are some kids, right? And so one thing we talk about is generalized anxiety. Sometimes people just have general worries about things in the world. So that might be this young gentleman here. He's just kind of worried. He maybe looks a little sad too, although I think this is sweat. And so not tears, right? I mean, also kids often have separation anxiety, which I think the lower school teachers are pretty familiar with, right? It's kind of hard to say goodbye to mom in the morning at drop-off. And then another aspect of anxiety that is really difficult for kids is social anxiety, where that is defined by a fear of being judged for your performance in front of others. So people with social anxiety don't like what I'm doing at all, right? I don't have that problem. Or if I do, I've overcome it. But I think that this is something that is really challenging for kids in school. And then I think the last one, yeah, I have it on here, specific phobias. And so I also want to mention, so specific phobias, I think people are familiar with, like a fear of spiders or a fear of snakes. We actually often wonder in my lab, like, what about a fear of books? So that's a study we would love to do, is put kids in a scanner and show that, in an MRI scanner, I'll talk more about this, and show them fearful stimuli, like a snake, and show them a book and see if that elicits a similar sort of reaction. We haven't got there yet. But in any event, the last thing I want to mention when you think about anxiety is physiologic reactions. So oftentimes when people are anxious, as adults, with our adult lens, we probably think like, oh, anxiety means I'm worried, I'm thinking about bad things happening, I can't stop thinking about these bad things happening. But there's also a physiological reaction that happens in our body where our heart rates go fast, our skin temperature goes up, we might sweat, you might feel butterflies in your stomach. And those are things that you may experience and then not be able to put a label to, and that's part of anxiety. And then the third part of anxiety that people often don't remember to think about is avoidance. So people who are anxious will avoid the thing that makes them anxious to the end, right? So if you think about the kid who's really anxious about reading that book, they're just going to avoid. That is only going to make the anxiety increase. But it's a very important aspect of anxiety disorders that we often forget to think about. So there's the feelings, the physical piece, and the behavioral piece of avoidance. So that's what I want us all to remember when I'm talking about anxiety. So what do we know about anxiety and reading? We know for many years of research that negative influence between anxiety symptoms and on reading achievement, right? So If you have anxiety, it might make your reading lower. And if you have, I should actually have a kid reading here. I don't know. Those cartoons are just wrong. Sorry. And then if you have reading, so this should be a kid reading. So if you have a reading problem, you might feel more anxious. And if you feel anxious, you might have more of a reading problem. And we know this from epidemiologic studies. Those are big population studies where we look at the co-occurrence of reading and anxiety disorders. And in fact, in children, that's about 30%. And we also know that children with a reading disorder have a higher risk for an anxiety disorder than kids without a reading disorder. So we're pretty sure these things go together. And then about 10 years ago, Sharon Vaughn, whose work I'm going to talk a lot about tonight, and her partner, Amy Grills, they did a study where they wanted to understand this relationship between anxiety and reading in kids. And they wanted to know, chicken and the egg, does the reading problem come first, make you anxious, or are you anxious and that makes you have trouble with your reading? And so they set up this experiment where they measured kids' anxiety and reading at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. And they hypothesized that if children had trouble with reading at the beginning of the year, and that predicted their anxiety problems at the end of the year, that would say it went in that direction. And then they also measured their anxiety at the beginning of the year, and if that predicted their reading at the end of the year, that would say the relationship went in this other direction. And if both models held up, then they would infer that this was in fact a bidirectional relationship. And that's in fact what they saw, was that anxiety at the end of the year was predicted by reading fluency. So that's really how efficiently you read and with intonation. And then also, and as well as decoding. But on the reverse side, it was only fluency that was predicted by anxiety. So anxiety was predicted by fluency problems and decoding problems, but fluency was predicted by anxiety. So that's pretty much the take-home story there, that we kind of understand there's this bidirectional relationship, at least with reading fluency, which I think holds true with a lot of what I've seen clinically. I always say the kids who come in with anxiety, they're going to be the slow readers. And the slow readers, I'm always saying to my trainees, like, have you looked at anxiety? Because anxiety also sneaks under the radar, especially when parents come in worried about their reading, want to get extra time on the SAT, or worried about their reading, want to get them into Windward. You know, we also have to worry about what's their anxiety look like. So I was interested in this bidirectional relationship to understand, was there a common biological mechanism underlying this co-occurrence of reading and anxiety problems? And prior studies have really looked in MRI studies at circuits that underlie reading in the brain in kids with reading disorders. And we had other studies had looked at anxiety circuits in the brain that underlie anxiety disorders. And we wanted to know, what was the brain basis of anxiety in reading disorder? So we really started to look at the neural signature of anxiety in children with reading disorder. And we published this paper in 2017 with a postdoc in my lab, Katie Davis. And this, the journal liked the paper so much they asked us to do the cover. So it was developmental science. And this was kind of fun. This is actually my youngest kid. And when they asked me to do the cover, I was really irritated. I was like, it's another email. They want me to do more stuff. What are they talking about? I'm not an artist. And I complained about this at dinner one night. My husband, who's an artist, was like, I'm an artist. So I was like, well, if you have an idea, have at it. So he came up with this concept. And then the youngest is also a budding artist applying to art schools for next year for college. And so they came up with this idea, and they did this photo shoot. And I just love it. I think it's really fun. So this really is the study I'm going to tell you about now. So to get you ready to understand the study, I need to teach you a little bit about the brain and anxiety in the brain. So the neural signature of pediatric anxiety, what is that? We know that the amygdala is a threat detection center in the brain. And we know this from seminal work, for example, in lesion studies. So when there are adults and something terrible happens to them, like they have a stroke or an injury and they lose part of the brain, we can then look at behaviors that change as a function of that. So there's a famous case, SM, who had the amygdala destroyed on both sides of her brain, and it really reduced her ability to feel any fear. So the amygdala is a threat detection center. And what we come to understand now is that when we feel threat, we might feel anxious. So the amygdala is not an anxiety center. The amygdala is for threat detection. But from threat, we then infer something called anxiety. And so we think that when the amygdala is altered in some way, it could lead to anxiety. So when I show you this picture, your brain should say, that's a threat, right? And then your amygdala, which is here in this nice little cartoon, is going to activate in response to seeing that threat. And so we know from a bunch of studies over the last 15 years or so, first, brain structures. That's the size and the shape of structures in the brain, specifically the amygdala. So here's a picture of the brain, like cutting through the middle of the head, opening it up. Like if it was an orange, it's where the seeds are. And here's the amygdala. And this is showing us a coronal slice, so from the back of the brain looking forward. And so here's the amygdala, and what I want you to appreciate here is that on the x-axis is an anxiety scale. So as this gets higher, you have more anxiety. And here is the volume of the amygdala. So what this line is saying is that people with more anxiety have larger amygdala volumes. And put another way, in this study, what scientists showed was that whether you're looking at the left or the right hemisphere of the brain, for individuals with high anxiety, they have bigger amygdala volumes than for individuals with low anxiety. So what they inferred from this was that when your amygdala is enlarged, it's either a symptom or a cause of an anxiety disorder. We don't know, right? Because this is cross-sectional. I take a person and I say, oh, you have this bigger amygdala and you have anxiety. So I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. Then we can also do this thing, instead of looking at structure develops over time and is not so sensitive to changes, right? So I study brain structure and it's the effects of a chemical on the brain. But what about function? Function is happening right now. All your brains are functioning right now. And so I can measure that with task-based fMRI, which you're used to seeing. Like we put someone in this machine, which is a big giant magnet that can measure, actually, it can perturb the flow of molecules in blood. And we basically, based on the oxygenation level in your blood, we can infer what's happening in terms of activity in the brain. And so we have this fancy setup where there's a mirror and we can show you something on a screen and we can give you a button box to push a button and you go in this big magnet and we can put stuff from our computer here and see how you react. Like, am I showing you a snake or a book and what's happening to your amygdala? So in these seminal studies, kids were shown fearful faces. And what researchers found, this is again the amygdala, was that, I don't know if you can read this, but these were the healthy, is it not showing up at all? I think the color is kind of gone for you guys, I'm not sure. When I checked it earlier, it was there. Anyway, it's interesting. But the take home was that these are the kids with anxiety and they have increased activation. These are kids with depression, their activation was 0, and these are the healthy controls. Their activation was down here. So when they saw fearful faces, they didn't have any change in amygdala. But anxious kids, when they looked at this versus this, their amygdala really lit up. Like they went, wow. So that is an unusual, that's part of the signature, right? So now we know they have enlarged amygdala and their amygdala is overactivating in response to fearful stimuli. But we know that anxiety disorders are more complex than just identifying a threat. And we also know the brain is more than just a certain region. So modern neuroscience, we think that there's systems in the brain. This isn't just one region. The brain is interconnected and you don't only use 10% of your brain. Use your whole brain all the time. And so what systems neuroscience has shown us is that we need to think about circuits. And the way this works is here's this threat, right? But it's no longer a threat when you see that it's behind a cage. And the reason you don't feel anxious anymore when I show it's behind a cage is that you can appraise the stimuli and monitor responses, and those are your prefrontal cortices. And so what we've come to understand is that there's this relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, where when the amygdala turns on, and then the prefrontal cortex checks the stimuli, and the prefrontal cortex says, this is really not a threat, so it turns on and turns the amygdala off. So they're working like this. One is on and the other is off in a typical situation. And how do we know that? We know that from something called resting state. So I told you I could measure the structure of the brain, and I told you I could put someone in the scanner and show them stimuli and see how their brain fires. But we also put people in the scanner and just tell them, keep your eyes open and let your mind wander freely. That's a lot easier with a 5-year-old than asking them to do a task in the scanner, which is really noisy, and you can't move at all when you're getting a scan, or we have to start over. So with resting state, they just let their mind wander freely. And the way this works is we look, for example, here's the amygdala, that's our threat detection center, and here's the prefrontal cortex for monitoring, right? And what we're wondering is how these things fire together. And if they fire together, we make the inference that they're wired together. So here on the x-axis, I'm going to show you a time course. And on the y-axis, I'm going to show you the time course of brain activity from the amygdala. Okay, and now I can also measure, this person's just laying in the scanner, mind wandering freely. This is the time course of the prefrontal cortex. And what's important to appreciate here is that when this goes up, this goes down. When this goes up, this goes down. This goes up, this goes down. And so they seem unrelated, but they're actually systematically unrelated. They're systematically related -0.34, which means when the prefrontal cortex is on, the amygdala is off, but they're on and off together. It's not random noise. And so we infer from that that this anti-correlation is how a typical brain is working to dampen down the amygdala function that shouldn't be active to something that shouldn't be causing a threat reaction or a feeling of anxiety. There's also a developmental story here. So Dylan Gee, who's a pretty brilliant researcher at Yale, works very closely with CMI also. What she showed was that this negative connectivity between these two brain regions starts out positive in young kids, age 4 to 9. So here's their connectivity between their amygdala and their medial prefrontal cortex, and it's positive. Now, from age 10 to 17, it's a little below 0. And then when you get to be 16 to 22, 18 to 22, sorry, it gets very negative. So the point to appreciate is that it's getting more negative over time. And that's the developmental story. So someone asked me earlier, what do I wish we had? I wish we had longitudinal data. This is cross-sectional, right? These are all different people. I don't have a 4-year-old who's then 10, who's then 17, who's then 22. That would be a little more convincing, but this is pretty good. So what happens in pediatric anxiety disorders? Anxiety disorders are characterized by poor emotion regulation. And we know in children at age 4, we don't expect them to regulate so well, right? But as kids get older, we expect them to regulate. And if they're not regulating well, maybe it's the amygdala medial prefrontal cortex connectivity that's driving some anxiety. So, all right, I told you about the enlarged amygdala, overactivation. Now I've told you about this inverse association. And so this is normally what we expect is a negative relationship from here to here. And in anxiety disorders, we see a positive association. And so we set out knowing this as the backdrop to the study I want to tell you about. So we recruited, with the help of the Promise Project, actually, they funded my first ever learning disability study, really helped put me on the map. Recruited 7 to 12-year-olds from general and special education schools. This was quite the labor of love. Me and Lauren Thomas, who is a master's of education in school psych, we spent 2 years finding these kids, talking to school psychologists, talking to learning specialists. We had kids from Windward, we had kids from Gaynor, we had kids from public schools, and we had 21 kids with reading disorder and nothing else. They did not have an anxiety disorder, they did not have depression, they did not have ASD, autism spectrum, they did not have Tourette's, they did not have a motor disorder, they had a reading disorder. They could have had a writing or a math disorder. I mean, I was never going to find the unicorn of a kid with a reading disorder without any math or writing problems, right? I was not that delusional. Oh, and they didn't have any attention disorders. Did I forget to mention that? Yeah. So that was actually our third group. That was easy to fill. That bucket was really easy to fill, the kids with reading and attention problems. And then we had 22 typically developing kids. So to know they were typically developing, we gave them a very comprehensive psychiatric interview. What about reading? How do we call a kid having a reading disorder in this study? So in order to get to us, in order for us to even consider you, you had to have a suspected reading problem from your learning specialist or a history of trouble learning with reading or a previously diagnosed reading disorder. And then you had to come into my lab and do some tests and perform poorly on 3 out of 5 measures of pseudo-word reading, encoding like spelling, rapid naming, word reading accuracy, or silent or oral reading comprehension. I think I'm speaking to a pretty reading savvy crowd, so I don't need to define all of these things, right? Or I could. Pseudo-word reading is reading nonsense words, encoding is spelling, rapid naming is how fast you can name letters or digits or colors or number or objects. Word reading accuracy is what it sounds like, and so is comprehension. No other disorders. So then we made a reading impairment score, which I'm pretty proud of because most studies don't do this. We really, really understood these kids. We spent a lot of hours with them. And we gave them a score for every measure they did poorly on below the 25th percentile. Like I showed before, you needed 3 out of 5 to get in the study. But what if you were bad on all of them? Or what if you're only bad on 3? That could be a difference. Then what if you had a history of a trouble by teacher report? What if you had been to tutoring? What if you had a diagnosis? And what if you had placement in a special ed school? So each of those could add a point to your reading impairment. So it wasn't just, are you disorder, but how much is your impairment? Because there's a difference between a kid whose parents send them for a little bit of tutoring and they get better a little quickly. I have one of those. And there's a difference between a kid who's going to come to Windward and spend 6 years here. We probably could have even included how many years in special ed. So what about anxiety? We measured this with something called the RC-MAS, which is self-report of anxiety symptoms. I get nervous when things don't go the right way for me. I'm afraid of things. I feel someone will tell me I do things the wrong way. When I worry when I go to bed. So this was self-report. So that's how we measured reading. That's how we measured anxiety. And what we found on the x-axis is the reading disorder, the kids with reading disorder versus the typically developing kids. And on the y-axis is their anxiety scores. So here's what we found. This shouldn't be a surprise. This is replicating what all these other studies had shown. Kids with reading disorder have more anxiety symptoms than the typically developing kids. What's unusual is that our kids did not have an anxiety disorder diagnosis, right? So that means they had some symptoms that they reported, but not enough, and not enough impairment from those symptoms to meet the threshold and get a diagnosis. So here I'll show you anxiety on the x-axis and reading impairment scores on the y-axis. So this is showing the same data another way, right? The bar graph shows you sort of overall reading disorder group versus typically developing, but this is showing you continuous variables. And you can see a pretty nice upward sloping line that the more anxiety someone has, the higher their reading impairment. Or I could have done the graph the other way and said the more reading impairment they have, the more anxiety they have. And again, here's anxiety going with reading fluency. So reading fluency, remember, high scores are good. So this line is going to slope the other way, right? So the more anxiety you have, the worse your reading fluency. Okay, but what about the brain? So here's this normal circuit. And what we know is that if you have a hot, positive connectivity between these, that's the signature of an anxiety disorder. And so here I'll show you, that's funny. I don't know what all those hash marks are. The red, that's reading disorder on the left and typically developing on the right. And so here are the typically developing kids, like I showed you before. We're expecting their connectivity. These got a little messed up. I looked at them before and they were okay. Anyway, apologies. This should say amygdala, medial prefrontal cortex connectivity. And so here what you see is that the association between these two brain regions is negative. I don't know what's going on here. And then you can just trust me that this is 0. Oh, geez, I went the wrong way. Sorry. Okay, so here's our graph. This is 0, and so their connectivity is in the negative range. And here are the kids with reading disorder, and their anxiety, their circuitry connectivity values are above 0. So that's just supporting this idea, right, that they show the neural signature of an anxiety disorder. So these are kids with a reading disorder diagnosis, no anxiety disorder diagnosis, but they're showing the neural signature of an anxiety disorder. So we thought that was pretty interesting. This is just a brain slices. These are axial slices of the brain parallel to the floor. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. This is the amygdala, and here's the medial prefrontal cortex. And we showed that this connectivity was higher, statistically significantly higher in the kids with reading disorder than the healthy kid, than the typically developing kids. And so what I think is really interesting, this is brain connectivity against anxiety. This is a replication. This is what we expect, right? The more anxiety you have, the more negative, the more positive, sorry, the connectivity should be. And that's what I've been showing you all day, right? That the kids with an anxiety disorder have positive association between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is not turning the amygdala off the way it should. But what we were really more interested in was what was the relationship between connectivity and reading. And so here what we found was that with the neural signature of a pediatric anxiety disorder, as this connectivity got more positive, their reading impairment got more positive. And so we put that all together into a model showing that anxiety was associated with reading impairment. That wasn't new. That's a behavioral finding people knew for a long time. And here's the brain signature predicting anxiety. That wasn't new. What was new was that the brain signature was predicting their reading impairment. And we did some fancy causal modeling called a mediation analysis to show that this anxiety symptoms were on the causal pathway, suggesting what this says is that the more anxiety a kid has, the worse their reading is going to be. And so I think this is quite relevant to what you all are dealing with. And when I was in the classroom visiting today, I even saw a teacher, ask a student, why did you answer this way? And the student sort of started to answer a little. And the teacher was so intuitive, said, well, your answer is correct. I just want you to explain why you did it that way. And then the student could access and express what they knew. And I think that happens both ways, that when someone feels anxious, they may not be able to express, and when they're anxious, they may not be able to take information in. So it's really important that we're attuned to someone's emotional state when they're trying to learn or perform. And that's what we're hoping these kind of studies will help us do. So the conclusions are if we could reduce reading-related anxiety, reading might improve. The other thing I'll say about this study is, are we adequately measuring anxiety? So I think that the DSM is probably overlooking kids whose anxiety stems from reading or learning disabilities. So we have anxiety about separation, we have anxiety about general fears, we have anxiety, we have phobias of particular items, but we don't ask things like, I get nervous when I'm asked to read out loud. I worry about reading subtitles in a movie or on TV. I worry about being called on to read aloud in class. I get nervous that I'll have trouble doing my homework by myself. We don't ask these questions when we're assessing for an anxiety disorder. I mean, we do in my clinic, but we don't in the world. And Amy Grills has actually made a reading anxiety scale that hopefully will be coming out soon. So that's what I have to say about anxiety. And I'm going to now turn attention to talk about executive functions. And then in the third study, I'll show you how they come together. So in this study, again, in my lab, I was really saying to myself, I work with these kids, I tutor them, they have these executive function problems, what's going on? So the tripartite model of executive function says there's this thing called working memory, that's holding information in mind and manipulating it. If you want to practice that, I'm going to say some numbers. Try and say them aloud in reverse order. 3, 7, 2, 4. That's hard, right? You have to hold it, you have to use it. That's working memory. Mental flexibility is another executive function, so that's where a lot of times we test this by asking people to do something a different way. So what does off the hook mean? Wild and crazy, or the phone is off the hook, right? So we have language tests where we ask kids, here's one meaning, tell me one meaning, now tell me another meaning. And so, you know, we think of that as a language problem, but it's actually the executive function too is how we test that. So multiple meanings or shifting, thinking outside the box, these kinds of things. The one I'm going to focus on today is called cognitive control, which is the ability to control your thoughts, like this is the famous test. So name the ink color, don't read the word.
Red, blue, green.
Hard, right? Yes, because what you have to do is put the brakes on. Your brain is now hardwired to read the words because you're readers. And then you have to put the brakes on, not read the word, and activate an unusual rule. And that's what I was particularly interested in. We knew that executive functions were well associated with problems in reading. In fact, there are studies showing that if you do executive function intervention training with preschoolers, their reading and math achievement is better in kindergarten, first, second, third grade. That's pretty good causal evidence. We also know there are really well-defined brain circuits for cognitive control, but what we don't understand was whether the brain circuits for cognitive control have anything to do with reading. And I was really interested in that in the lab, the same way I was with anxiety. So why was I interested in this? Because I used to teach kids to read. Now, I know this is not how you're supposed to teach read, mat, fat, cat, sat, rat, but that's how our brains are wired. We're wired to learn rituals and habits. And when it goes awry, we might end up with OCD, right? But we learn rat, fat, cat, sat, mat, hat. And then we ask kids to do this thing. We ask them to look at this. We ask them to identify a salient visual detail. We ask them to put the brakes on. Don't say rat. Instead, activate an unusual rule. Here's a magic E. He makes the vowel say his name. You read this as rate, not ratty, which they might want to do, right? So that's how a cognitive neuroscience person thinks about word reading, as opposed to, I have a great deal of respect for the way science of reading teachers think about this too, in terms of the magic E and word families, et cetera. But when I start to think about what is the neural system underlying this, I'm thinking about cognitive control. So what? Yeah. So in fact, we put kids, these same kids, I told you about them. They came in, they did our study. We had them come in and do the scan. And we also had them do this task. Now, I didn't use the Stroop test. 2 reasons. Well, 1 reason, really. It's words. And these are kids with reading problems. So people with reading problems or people who are illiterate do very well on the Stroop because the words have no salience for them. So it's easy for them. It's like if you crossed your eyes and tried to do that Stroop task. So instead of the Stroop, we have them do the Simon. And the instructions are press the button that indicates the direction the arrow is facing. So your brain is hardwired to press right because there's something appearing on the right side. And here it is appearing on the left. These are called congruent. These are easy trials. In an incongruent trial, you have a left-facing arrow on the right side of the screen. Your brain wants to press right. You have to put on the brakes, overcome, and press left. So that's what we did. And here's what happened. This was so hard to do as an experiment because the kids had so much trouble with the task that it was almost impossible to model it in the brain. So here are the kids with typically developing and reading disorder diagnosis on the x-axis, and here's their mean % correct on my Simon task. So it doesn't look so whopping here, but it's a pretty darn big difference. The kids with reading disorder were hovering around 60%. I mean, you got a 50% chance of getting it. It's 1 or 2, right? And then the healthy kid, the typically developing kids were up at around 90%. So the other way we looked at this was we gave 3 bunches of trials, and the kids who were having trouble, the kids with reading disorder had trouble on all 3 runs, half of them. I had to throw away half the data. I literally had half the kids whose task I couldn't use. I had to recruit more and more kids. And then the healthy kids, you can see every single one of them had good accuracy on at least 1 run. Only half the kids with a reading disorder had good accuracy on 1 run. So this was like, as my dad used to say, he was an experimental psychologist, it would have passed the blunt interocular exam. Like, boom. Those data should just hit you between the eyes, right? Like the kids with reading disorder, half of them couldn't do the task very well, and all of the typically developing kids could do the task. So we weeded out all the ones who couldn't do the task, and we still managed to find some signal. And what we found, this is how you do task MRI. You say, well, find me a brain region across the entire surface of the cortex that might be different between these 2 groups. And so this shows that the kids with reading disorder are overactivating this right prefrontal cortex relative to the kids with reading disorder, or relative to the typically developing kids. So here's the activation in the reading disorder group, here's the activation in the typically developing group, and here's the subtraction. And what this says is that the kids with reading disorders are overengaging a right frontal cortice to resolve the cognitive conflict of the Simon test. So to put the brakes on and press left instead of right, these kids are overusing the right frontal cortex. So I'm guessing Alexis and Jamie are thinking, gee, that really fits what we know about kids with dyslexia. They overuse what we call homologous regions. So on the left, if you have if you have a frontal cortex, the homologous region on the right. It's the same region, but on the other hemisphere. The understanding is that kids with dyslexia will overuse the homologous region on the other hemisphere. And that's exactly what we're showing here, but not in a reading task, in a cognitive control task. And that's what made this so unusual. And then we also showed word reading accuracy on the x-axis and brain activation during the Simon test. Look at that. So the better your word reading accuracy, the more you overengage this right frontal cortex. So it's really a compensatory mechanism. It's really fitting with this model of dyslexia as overusing the right hemisphere. So that was the take-home message. And so we also had a connectivity story of cognitive control circuits in this, and what we showed was that at rest, the connectivity of these resting states of these cognitive control circuits correlated with the overengagement of this right frontal cortex during the engagement of cognitive control. So we had a whole resting state and task fMRI story in this paper, which took like 3 years to get published because reviewers could not understand. Well, not really 3 years. It really took 18 months, but it felt like 3 years. It really points to the need that we look at circuits other than reading circuits to find targets for treatment. So we know in reading, when you take a kid with a reading problem and you put them in the scanner, most reading researchers have them do a reading task. Well, that would make a lot of sense, right? Like, if you have kids with reading problems, you want to know what's going wrong in their brain while they're trying to read. And from that, we know there's this, what we call a left lateralized, so it's just on the left, circuit that connects the front to the middle to the back that's active during good reading, and in people who are poor readers, it's less active. But I'm trying to show here that if we pay attention to what we know holistically from thinking about these kids, that they have these other behavioral problems like executive function problems and anxiety, and now we're showing that the neural circuits underlying these problems are at play in kids with reading disorders. So it suggests targets for medication maybe, and it suggests targets for intervention, and it also are targets for measuring successive interventions, because sometimes things work before we can see them. So sometimes what you're doing in your classrooms is working even though you go home at night and think, I can't reach this kid. Sometimes their brain circuits are changing. It's just slow. It's slow going, and it's hard for them, and it's hard for you as teachers, but it does happen. And if we had this kind of monitoring where we could say the circuit's changing, hold on for the behavior, it's coming, it's the caboose, you know? Like the brain has to change before the behavior can change. So that's another reason sometimes I think it's useful to have brain imaging data. Otherwise, I go back to why are we looking in the brain, and we should just look at behavior. So the third study I want to show is from Jun Liu. She did this in Martha Ann Bell's lab when she was a graduate student. Then Jun came and was a postdoc fellow with me, and now is a faculty member at Beijing Normal. I'm super proud of her, and she's actually my first postdoctoral fellow who went on to have a big faculty job. And I really love working with Jun. And part of the reason I wanted Jun to come to the lab as a fellow was she had done this study. And when she showed it to me, I was like, you've come from heaven to me. Like, she was the first applicant for this postdoctoral fellowship that I posted. And I was like, I'm swinging at the first pitch, because she was amazing. We've published a bunch of nice papers together. So what she had shown in 184 kids who were a community sample in somewhere on this eastern seaboard, but sort of down south. I forget where Martha Ann Bell's lab is. I think it's on the coast. I'm not positive. I'm very bad at geography. So anyway, she showed, and it was 75% of the kids in this sample are white. They're mostly higher socioeconomic status, but they're just a community sample. They came to participate in science. They didn't come because they were worried about their kids having a problem. And so what she saw was she looked at something at age 2 called negative affectivity. And this is how fearful a child is, or how much they're afraid to approach novelty, how much they shy away from novelty. And that is actually a well-known marker of later anxiety risk. And that comes from 30 years of research out of Jerry Kagan's lab at Harvard. So, he showed if you have a 4-month-old baby sitting in the car seat and you wave a dangly mobile in front of them and the baby goes like this, that's called behavioral inhibition. They're going away from the novel thing. Most babies are going to reach for the novel toy in front of their face. And the babies who rear away are at higher risk for social anxiety disorder later. And there's very good research showing that. So what Jun was interested in was if you had this early life marker of anxiety, what would happen to your reading and math? And if you had anxiety, executive function problems, did that influence it? And what she showed was, in fact, this mediation. So the more negative affect you had at age 2, the lower your reading and math would be at age 6. And if your executive functions at age 4 were lower, you had even more reading and math problems. So we wanted to replicate this in the Healthy Brain Network data, because Jun's sample was small and her sample was mostly white. So we looked at what was available in the Healthy Brain Network data set. There's a lot of data, and we had some ways of getting negative affect, some ways of getting executive function. These matched pretty well to what Jun had, except for older kids. And we had reading and math, because I got to stuck them in there. That was my job, so I was very happy about that. And what we did a model, and we controlled for gender and ADHD and other just measures of externalizing, because 80% of the kids in the Healthy Brain Network sample have an ADHD diagnosis, and we controlled for socioeconomic status. And we were hoping to replicate the model, so I promised you I was going to show you tonight some unpublished data that I don't understand, so here they are. What we found in 2,789 referred kids was that, as you would expect, higher executive function goes with better reading skills. But more negative affect, or negative affectivity really, goes with higher executive function and with better reading skills. So this is very confused. Someone's shaking their head at me like, that's just wrong, right? I was like, did you code the data right? I have 2 data analysts in my team full time. I made Christy give the data to Bonnie. Then I made them both give it to the director of neuroscience in my lab, who's a whiz at stats. Like, we've vetted this pretty well. I'm pretty sure there's no coding error. Pretty sure these are the results. And what I think is that when we take kids who are heavily selected to have anxiety and other mental health problems, we know that negative affect is a risk marker for anxiety problems. So I'm not surprised that these go together, right? It's kind of like if you imagine the whole universe of people who have an anxiety disorder at the top, I'm skimming all of them off the top. And we know a risk marker for having the anxiety disorder is to have the negative affect. And the piece of the puzzle I haven't told you is this is what they've added to Jerry Kagan's model, is that if you have negative affect and you have higher executive functions, in some cases, they think of it as an over-controlling style. So if you're worried about what's going on in your environment, like you're worried you're going to drive your bike over the edge of the bike line when you're riding your bike in New York City, and then you're overly monitoring for going over the edge, you're in worse trouble. Like, you need to not overly focus on that, right? And that's your executive function. So as your executive functions ramp up and your anxiety is up, you will be at higher risk. And so I think those are the kids we're getting, so this doesn't surprise me so much. But what I really am having trouble making sense of is this. So what are we to tell teachers and parents? You know, so I think what we need to do is think about how do we harness the strength of higher executive function and overcome the discomfort someone feels when they have negative affect and anxiety, right? Because they're going to have higher reading when they have higher executive function, but they're also going to have higher negative affect. And so we need to help kids think about ways to feel better here, which brings me, I think perfectly timed, maybe I'm a little behind, I'm not sure, we started a little late, to the second part of the talk, which is that anxiety and executive function are intertwined in their contributions to reading and math problems. And I want to show you three kinds of interventions, yeah, I think I'm good, that are trying to address this. So the first is from Sharon Vaughn. And they have done a classroom intervention where they actually taught teachers using something called the Strong Students Toolbox, cognitive behavioral techniques for treating anxiety to use in the context of a reading lesson. So they had three groups. They had a small group reading intervention, so those kids got reading instruction with anxiety management, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. Then the next group got reading intervention with the intervention specialist, but math fact practice instead of anxiety practice, and then business as usual. And so here's how we think about treating an anxiety disorder. We think about three things. You need to recognize anxious feelings. You need to, one thing you can do, this is controversial among, I'm not going to get into it, but one thing you can do is help people learn to relax and manage their stress. And the third is to recognize and then challenge and replace unhelpful and negative thoughts. And these are sort of the core components. If you come to me and I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist going to treat your anxiety, I'm going to do this. And here are some of the skills that we can do with kids. Like if you've got to recognize your thought, you have to learn how to recognize your stress and identify your feelings. And then you have to catch the thoughts and stamp them out. So I'm going to walk you through how these processes work. I do think it's worth taking a minute and just saying, so what we want to do is, first you want someone to know if my heart is racing and I'm sweating, that could be anxiety. And then you want them to maybe think about doing some of these breathing exercises or progressive relaxation of their muscles to quell their anxiety. And I say that's controversial because I told you before, avoidance is the culprit in anxiety. And many anxiety researchers and treating physicians think that the point of treatment for anxiety is not to get rid of someone's anxiety. It's to tell the person and help them learn to live through their anxiety. So the person learns, I feel anxious, but I can live through it. Because if you teach them that the goal is to get rid of their anxiety, it's an avoidance of the anxious feeling. It's kind of paradoxical. But there are many people who treat anxiety still with these relaxation techniques, and this intervention was done with typically developing kids in large public schools, classrooms in Texas. So these aren't kids with anxiety disorder, they just have some anxious symptoms. And there's no reason not to use these kind of, not to use these kind of relaxation techniques with typically developing kids who have some anxiety, or maybe like the kids that were in my study. And then you want them to identify these thoughts, get rid of the automatic thoughts, challenge them, replace them with something more positive. Okay, so how do they do this with these kids? This is Claude the Squirrel. I love Claude the Squirrel. These were for 4th and 5th graders, and they're really letting kids identify what are the physiologic and cognitive processes that you experience when you're anxious, so they can label them, right? I have cold hands, I can't think, I can't focus, I'm dizzy, I'm sweating, I have a lump in my throat. So they work with Claude the Squirrel to identify, and then they do the relaxers. So here's one, I think everybody should do this. Take your hands, squeeze your hands really, 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 really tight and let go. Do you feel that little burst? That is actually going to help regulate your physiologic reactivity and experience of anxious symptoms. And then they did these, this is a way of illustrating how they stamp out negative thoughts and identify them. They do these kind of vignettes. So here if you can read this, it says, Maria was late getting to the lunchroom. When she walked in, she saw a table with a bunch of her friends sitting, and she started to walk to them, and when she got about halfway there, she noticed they were all laughing, and she thought to herself, oh no, they're all laughing at me because I had to stay after class. I bet they think I'm stupid. And this is a perfect example of how maybe not at the neural level, but at the behavioral level, a kid with a learning disorder and their anxiety come together, right? This is really the heart of the problem for some of these kids. And so what they do in the Strong Students Toolbox is let you figure out how your thoughts and emotions go together in these situations. And then they have worksheets where they can, like, how did she feel? What did she do next? And they use really interesting techniques like if you were a detective, use a magnifying glass, what feelings would you see here? Or if your friend told you this story and they walked in the lunchroom, my friends were thinking about me, I feel stupid, what would you say to your friend? That's how you help them appraise the negative thoughts or the irrational negative thoughts. And then you help them learn ways to replace those thoughts. So what did we learn from Sharon's study was that anxiety symptoms, guess what? They went down. That's great. Okay, so what is great about that is that you could teach teachers to do these kinds of things with kids in the classroom and their anxiety will go down. So these aren't kids with anxiety disorders, but these are kids with some symptoms of anxiety, which puts them at more risk for later anxiety and drug use and all the other things we don't want kids doing. And then what about their reading? Their reading comprehension went up. So you gave kids an anxiety intervention and their reading scores improved. And that is beautiful, right? That is really proving that we need to attend to the whole child, which is the point of the whole lecture tonight. So these initial findings are very promising. They want to replicate this. This is funded by NICHD. It's just really great work. So the next program I want to talk about is called I Can Succeed. Started out as a manualized treatment for adolescents and then was expanded to treat kids in elementary school and preschool with specific learning disorder, SLD. So this is, it targets academic, emotional, interpersonal, and social functioning. And it's based on something called interpersonal psychotherapy for depressed adolescents, which was developed by Laura Muffson, who's my boss. She's the Division Director of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, or the Interim Acting Division Director of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Columbia right now. And she adapted interpersonal therapy for adults, which was quite successful in treating depression for adolescents. And the focus is on developing someone's intrapersonal skills, like self-awareness, perseverance, goal setting, emotion regulation, coping, and their interpersonal skills. So effective use of social support, self-advocacy, direct communication. And what was so groundbreaking about this as a depression treatment was, if you're depressed, you isolate. And what therapists realized, we need to help our depressed patients get out of their room, get out of their apartment. So important right now after the pandemic, thinking about how do you activate the social support, or how did we activate social support during the pandemic? And we have some data showing that the less access kids had to media, the less they had access to friends and the more stress they experienced during the pandemic. That's still under review. It takes a really long time to publish a paper these days. So these are the key, like intrapersonal and interpersonal skills. And so what they did in ICS was first adapt this for adolescents. And this was done by individual therapists with adolescents. And so the idea was to do psychoeducation and establish kind of, you're a kid with a learning disorder, these are the things that are hard for you, and here's the goals of what we're working on, and do you buy in? And if they buy in, okay, great. And then strengthen the relationship with parents, work with school staff, figure out where are those social supports for kids, and then in sessions 4 through 12, work on skills enhancement in sessions with kids, so like effective use of social support, self-advocacy, et cetera. But this was very tailored, so the therapist is meeting with the kid individually and can say, like, you know, you have trouble getting your reading done on time. How can you advocate for yourself? You could let your English teacher know that you have dyslexia, and so you may be late on this reading, or you might need the reading in advance so that you had more time to get it done if you want to be on time, et cetera. And then I think what's more kind of relevant, well, not more relevant, but of great interest, is how they developed this social emotional learning program for younger children. And there they developed this thing called the ICS triangle, which brings together mood, learning, and relationships. So what they've done here, most SEL focuses on this. How are you feeling? And who are the people in your world? How are you treating them? How is how they're treating you making you feel? You get angry, and what happens with them? And then what happens with them? How does it, right? But what they added in here was the learning component, which is pretty neat. And there, what they're doing is, I made a few notes just so I could, like, because I knew I'd forget. So they really are focusing on helping kids develop self-awareness, organizational skills, self-regulatory skills, direct communication skills. How can you change your expectations so they are more realistic? How do you do perspective taking? How do you do effective negotiation in your environment? And all of these things tying in with learning skills. So that what they found, they did 2 clinical trials, and what they found was that for the 9 and 10-year-olds and for the preschools, that as you improve social emotional learning, language-related academics also improve. So I think that that is just, and I should say, these treatments were delivered by teachers 1 session a week. 1 session a week for preschoolers, 1 session a week for 9 and 10-year-olds. And their social emotional learning went up and their language-based academics went up, which is just pretty remarkable. And so they really focus on the interaction of these mood, relationships, and academics. So I'm going to end and just wrap it up by talking about what is homework therapy. So that's in the first 10 years of my career, before I decided to be a researcher and I was practicing and working with kids, I developed this treatment called homework therapy because I was a tutor. And then after I went to grad school to pay the bills, I was still tutoring people while I was in grad school. And then I finished grad school and I was working with these kids and I didn't want to abandon them. And I realized, like, oh, it's not separate. I'm being a psychologist while I'm in the room. And I had one kid who I saw whose parents were both therapists, and he challenged me a lot. And he would say to me one day in session, I'll never forget this, he said to me, "Why are you doing this? Like, you have your PhD, you're a doctor. Why are you wasting your time as a tutor now?" And then I said to him, "You think I'm wasting my time? I don't think I'm wasting my time. I greatly enjoy working with you." And we moved on, we did his math. And he came in the next week and he told me a dream. He just walked in and told me that he had this dream. And then from there, we were sort of off. And I said, "Why do you think you're telling me this dream? Do you think that the tutoring and how you feel are interconnected?" And we kind of developed this together. Like, this was, you know, I really credit him for making me start to think. Like, he was really challenging me in my own self-worth. Like, am I just doing this to earn a buck? Or why did I get this PhD? And how does all this work together? And I realized that we were working together and thinking about how he felt about his learning, where he felt in his family of very high achieving people, and he was having a really hard time. So you could see it was all very interesting. And I realized that what I was doing with him was the academic, the psychological, and the cognitive. So with him, we were doing a lot of cognitive remediation also. And so homework therapy is what I developed. And in the lexicon of play therapy, talk therapy, behavior therapy, homework is the medium we work in. So I once showed this to a supervisor early on, and they said, "I do homework with a kid sometimes." And I was like, "Oh, that's the difference. We do it every time." Homework is expected, and it's accepted. And so it is the currency in the room for us. And that makes our therapy a little different than most other therapies, because most therapy is not governed by something outside. So when you come in for a homework therapy session, someone is telling you what you have to do. When you go for a therapy session and you're worried about X, Y, or Z, no one's telling you what you have to talk about. Although if you're worried about losing your job or you're worried about the pandemic, you know, things are telling you what to talk about. But it isn't so top down from a classroom. So that is something that's quite unique about homework therapy. And we code this as psychotherapy, and so far, okay. And what we're trying to do is go after the academic impairments associated with a specific learning disability, as well as the psychological and the cognitive components. And so our dual training is as psychologists and learning specialists, which allows us to move fluidly between the emotional and the cognitive aspects of a learning disorder. So that's what I'll say about that. So what I want to do to really depict what we do in homework therapy, so homework therapy is different from the first 2 treatments I showed you, where we're pushing the psychological into the classroom. Here we're pushing the classroom into the therapy room. And I'm going to read you this vignette that is a case study we did a few years ago. I invited my friend Gail Foreman, who's a best-selling young adult novelist. And we first practiced amongst ourselves. We disguised about 20 cases. And we disguised age and sex, and we mixed diagnoses. And then we presented cases to Gail, and she asked lots of questions because she used to be a journalist. And then she wrote these vignettes for us, and they're in the book. And so I thought I'd read one because I think it's the best sort of way of illustrating. And I think then I'm right on time. So when Andy was in 4th grade, this is Andy, the Homework Wars. When Andy was in 4th grade, he was diagnosed with several disorders: reading, writing, math, language, ADHD. By the time he was in 5th grade, he'd become utterly resistant to doing homework. When faced with an assignment, the self-assured, sporty 10-year-old regressed, acting more like a 4-year-old. "No, no, no," he would cry. "Please don't make me do it," as if he were being tortured, which Andy believed he was. During one of his first sessions, he told his therapist, homework was invented as a form of punishment. Look it up. His behavior perplexed his parents, who didn't understand why he became so distraught, particularly when his homework load was relatively light, a few math problems and a social studies worksheet. Andy's reaction seemed over the top. His therapist immediately recognized that Andy's anxiety around homework had grown into a phobia and that they'd have to get a handle on the anxiety first. So using the cognitive behavioral therapy model, she began with basic psychoeducation, explaining to Andy how everyone is anxious, normalizing it, and how anxiety evolved as a survival skill to prevent us from getting eaten by bears, an analogy that he particularly appreciated. So she then explained how anxiety created a fight or flight response and how this manifested physiologically. Blood starts pumping, breathing gets shallow, butterflies in the stomach, and Andy recognized many of those symptoms. And together, they were able to create a chart for him. Oh, did I lose it? I did. Whoops. Together, they were able to create a chart for him to recognize the signs and level of his anxiety and developed strategies for quelling the anxiety, including deep breathing, like I showed you, progressive muscle relaxation, like I showed you, distraction. For Andy, this was a game of Uno, and cardio bursts. So only when the anxiety, I lost it again, sorry guys. Only when the anxiety was under control could his therapist delve into the work. Andy often received social studies worksheets to complete, simple enough for some students, but for one with dyslexia and fine motor skills challenges like Andy, the work was exponentially harder. His therapist worked collaboratively with him. Her goal was to take away the elements that were belabored by his disability. She read passages aloud to him, had him dictate his responses. Once relieving him of the onerous and anxiety-provoking parts of the work, she was able to see that Andy could understand and synthesize the material. He could create complex responses. He just couldn't do this by reading and writing the way he'd been taught. As his confidence grew, she had Andy take over more of the work, alternating reading passages with her, writing some of the responses himself instead of dictating them. Because of his phobia of homework, because his phobia of homework had made Andy avoidant of it, his therapist framed the short-term benefits of skipping homework, which was relief, being outweighed by the long-term consequences, which was the anxiety. And to further desensitize him from the phobia, she used a sort of exposure therapy. Together, right, exposure therapy, that's how we treat spider phobias. Together, they would look at Andy's assignments, and when Andy resisted starting one, she would remind him of previous weeks when they had completed a social studies worksheet and how relieved he had been, validating his success, reminding him of the benefits of completing an assignment. Slowly, Andy became less resistant to doing his work. As they worked, his therapist stayed as attuned to Andy's emotional needs as his cognitive ones. And by gauging his mood, she could see the moments when Andy would be open to pushing a little further, trying to hone a new skill, even though these advances often happened 5 timed minutes at a chunk. So 5 minutes, 5 minutes. As they went, she checked in with him. How was he feeling? Was the strategy helping? Should they tell Andy's parents about it? She invited his parents into sessions, and in doing so, helped reframe Andy's aversion to homework, not as a product of defiance or laziness, but the way his brain worked differently than his peers. After 2 years of homework therapy, Andy still believed his homework was a form of torture, but he loves the feeling of having his homework finished and gets upset if he has to miss a session. At the encouragement of his therapist, he recently bought a graphic novel. And at a recent session, instead of requesting to play Uno, he asked if they could read instead. Then he took out his book, and for the first time in 2 years, the boy who was scared to read read out loud to her. So that is sort of an example of how we do homework therapy, moving back and forth between the tutoring, taking dictation, understanding the motor problem, understanding the reading problem, understanding the attention problem 5 minutes at a go, thinking of this as exposures, weaving in anxiety. And so I would say that homework therapy is quite different from the other two treatments because it's happening in the therapy room instead of in the classroom. And what we're trying to do is take things like a CBT or an Orton-Gillingham-based approach, these gold standard, evidence-based best practices, and weave them into a sequential approach that's individualized for each child so that they can obviously reach their full potential. And what we're hoping is to provide support alongside what they get in school or at home. And so the other thing I'll say about homework therapy, how is it working? There's really 3 basic tenets that I thought about, and I met again with the team a few weeks ago and asked them to tell me, what do you think is so great about homework therapy? And these were the things that came out, and these come out in this vignette, is that one is we're really trying to overcome the low self-esteem or poor self-concept kids have as a learner. We shift the focus of failure from the student to the instruction. So in school, it's your job to go to school and to learn, and teachers teach things and you're supposed to learn them. And when you come to us, and that can't be changed, right? That's the nature of school, that's the way it goes. And even at a place like Windward, where you're doing amazing flexibility of instruction and really breaking things down as much as possible, the implicit contract is that you will take in the information and learn it. And what we tell kids when they come in our session is, the only job you have here is to tell me if you don't get it. And if you don't get it, it's on me. I have to try a different way. I am the one who's falling down on the job, not you. Because they oftentimes, and most of our kids are not at Windward, they're sitting in a classroom where the instruction's going right over their head, and they're getting 1 hour of resource room a week, and the rest of the time they're sitting in class and they're feeling like a failure. So we're trying to shift that locus of failure and send this new message, and through that help kids develop, feel accepted, which is very important also. So the other thing that happens for kids with learning disorders long before they enter school is they're getting subtle messages from the environment and the world around them that they are different, that they're learning differently somehow. And so what we're trying to do is send a message, I got distracted. We're trying to do is send a message that these learning processes are different in our therapy room. So what do I mean by that? So no parent is trying to be mean to their child, but oftentimes we send these subtle messages like, yeah, it's bath time. Like, hey, don't you know, every night after dinner we go up for a bath. But if a kid has a sequence learning problem, they're not going to remember that it's bath time. And so they're getting this message, or they're going to the corner store and they're waiting for change and they're not able to check the change, and the guy behind the counter is like, did you check the change? And so they're getting these messages that they're doing things differently. And so we're trying to help students overcome this and feel more accepted for their cognitive style. And the last thing we're hoping is that they'll develop positive schemas about learning. So they're coming into our session, they're sitting next to us, and they're getting something done that is oftentimes hard for them. And here they're doing it and hopefully feeling good in the process of doing it, which I think happens in a lot of school settings like Windward, but maybe not when they're not getting direct instruction. So those are the basic tenets, and that's how homework therapy is working. So the last slide, I'll just say future directions. What I think we need bigger randomized controlled trials. We really need to move toward individualized interventions where we can try out ways of understanding the many complex factors that are at play for someone in their context when they're trying to learn. And we need to develop things like manuals for homework therapy, more manuals for ICS, the Strong Students Toolbox Manual. We need these kinds of things. And then we need implementation science, which is a field of science where we take all of these great tools that are being developed at the Windward Institute or my lab at Columbia or heavens, wherever else, and get them out into classrooms. And so that's the scalability problem. How do we get what you're doing here at Windward, or what I'm talking about in homework therapy, out into every public school classroom across the country so all children have access to learn to read? And with that, I'll just say thank you. Thank you for your attention, for having me today, and take questions? Okay. Thank you, guys. Questions? Oh, so you want to hand around the mic, or?
On one of your last slides, you talked about helping students develop positive schemas for learning.
Right.
And so for a lot of us lay people, one of the terms for that would be growth mindset. And I was just wondering if you could speak, would you just say that positive schemas for learning is just a synonym for that? Or do you have complicated feelings about growth mindset and all the research? We'd certainly be interested to hear that, because it's certainly something we've been thinking about here. And
Yeah.
where does that play into your thinking
Right.
about helping students in that way?
I love Carol Dweck.
Great.
So for those, Carol Dweck's research really focused on this idea of a growth mindset, right? When I was a grad student, actually, my first failed dissertation study was, I was tutoring kids at the Brooklyn Learning Center. And there was our philosophy about the SAT. We used to be pretty great SAT tutors back in the day. This was a long time ago. And we were tutoring kids, and our philosophy with the kids and with ourselves was, you know what, great if your score goes up, but what I really care about when you come in to do SAT with me is that you learn how to do the problem. And then I went to grad school, and I read Carol Dweck's work, and I was like, oh, this is what we're doing. We're focusing on process, not product. And I literally would say to kids, and their parents would call me up and yell at me, like, why'd you tell my kid their score doesn't matter? I'm like, because their score doesn't matter. Do you want a kid with a 1500, or do you want a kid who likes doing the math problems? Because which one is going to get the good job? Right? And then hopefully I didn't get fired. And I read Carol Dweck, and I thought she's talking about exactly what I'm talking about. And then I tried to show that what she was talking about were the most advantageous, that what she showed was that people who believed that intelligence was fixed had less persistence in the face of a challenge. They had less motivation. And people who believed intelligence was malleable would persist in the face of a challenge. And she tested this with something called impossible puzzles. So she would have people do these tasks that were unsolvable. And the kids who believed that intelligence was malleable would keep trying and keep trying. And I tried to show that in our kids, but it turned out all our kids believed that intelligence was malleable. So I didn't have any variability. So I had to scrap that dissertation. I didn't like that dissertation advisor anyway. So I moved on to a better world of neuropsychology. And so I think that growth mindset's super important. I think Carol Dweck, she left Columbia, went to Stanford. She's done some incredible work. I think that every single parent and teacher, we should all focus on process, not product. It helps people so much. It helps me with this is my self-talk. I'm like, Amy, it's the process, right? You love learning about how people learn. It doesn't matter if you get into nature or science. And so I think that's really important. I think it's part of developing a schema. I don't think it is the schema. I think the schema is what your automatic sort of vision or belief or internal representation of learning means. So for me, when I think about sitting with my lab, sitting with a postdoc fellow or a new graduate student, I feel positive and excited and optimistic most of the time. And that's my schema for mentorship. And so if you are a ninth grader going into history class, what's your schema? Like, do you love history? You really want to know the story? Are you dying to learn it? When you sit down to write a paper, are you like, man, I love creating sentences, and this paragraph just flows? So you want them to feel that, but that's really hard. So usually we first focus on there's this interpersonal relationship. And when I'm sitting with Amy in her office, I usually leave like, dang, it's great, my homework's done, but also like I felt good. Whereas sometimes when I sit and try to do my homework, even if someone's helping me, I feel terrible. And so that's the schema piece, I think. And I think the growth mindset is how you get to help someone develop a good schema. Carol Dweck might disagree. I don't know.
So you mentioned a study earlier, I think maybe it was your boss you said who did it, the connection between social emotional learning and literacy. Can you say again what that study was and then expand a little bit more on what part of social emotional learning was combined with the literacy instruction to get the positive results?
See, I made notes because I knew someone was going to ask me that tonight. So this is ICS. That's the ICS triangle where they've taken, ICS stands for I Can Succeed. Did I say that? Yeah, okay. So it's mood, relationship, and learning. And right, so Laura Mufson developed IPTA, and she collaborates with some Israeli researchers to develop ICS. And they started first as this individual treatment for adolescents and then extended it down and training teachers to do SEL with preschool and elementary school teachers. And they did these 2 clinical trials that are showing enhancement with one 45-minute session a week with a teacher, improvement in SEL and improvement in language arts. Those studies are written up in a chapter in our book. It's chapter 7, which I'm happy to share freely. I'm allowed to share one copy with one person. Then you don't have to buy the book. And Alexis, I think, has a copy, so she could share chapter 7 with you. And then in terms of how do you actually mesh, I mean, I was so excited when I was doing this book. I was like, okay, I want this section of the book to be about who's treating this stuff like I am. Like, who's doing this? Who's crossing this over? I've been thinking about this 20 years. This book was 20 years in the making. And then it actually all fell out of my head, like in May of 2020. I sat at the computer a lot and wrote a lot. And then I sent it to someone, and they were like, this should be a book. And I was like, man, it's 6 pages. Can't I just publish this? They're like, no, this has to be a book. So it took a few years. And I went around looking for people who were doing these kinds of treatments and interventions. And I was so happy to find Laura and her team and get them to write a chapter. I don't know what other papers they have, but the chapter does explain, but it doesn't really tell you how they mesh the language skill with the emotional skill. And I'm not sure they do. So I think homework therapy might really be the only place that I've seen where we're like saying, oh, you're writing. So for example, we treat kids with OCD. So this is an example of how we show that we're meshing the psychological and the academic in the same moment, which is what I'm trying to do in the research too, right? I'm trying to measure that in the scanner, and so with kids with OCD, they're perfectionistic, or they're writing a sentence and they will get stuck on a word and they can't move on because the sentence, you can't move on until you have the right word. So they write a word, they erase it, it's not the right word. They write another word, it's erased, and it's not the right word. So we make them, the exposure is that you put a blank space on, well, we created this. I don't know if it's the exposure, it's our exposure. We put a blank piece of paper over whatever word they've written and force them to write the rest of the sentence. That's the exposure. You have to finish the sentence. Then you can go back and edit if you want, because all good writers go back and edit, but you have to finish the sentence. And so that's an example, right, of how the psychological exposure therapy is happening in the context of the academic skill. I don't know how they're doing it with the preschoolers, and I reread part of the chapter today twice, trying to find it, because I knew you were going to ask me. These were my little notes. And none of them really say, like they say, oh, they teach self-regulation. Okay, we know that's part of the emotion. And they're teaching organizational skills. To me, that's not academics. That's cognitive. So I don't know. But we should find out. And I do think, like, I know Anna is also pretty excited about this opportunity to think about how ICS might work at your school or something like it. So I'm going to connect you all with them. They're super nice, really receptive, great researchers. And I'm sure they'd love to talk to you and think about how it would work in this context.
Other questions?
You shared a little bit about the study by the Healthy Brain Network, Child Minds study, and I was so curious about that correlation you found between negative affect and executive function, and I just immediately thought to myself, could that be because parents who enroll their child in the study, which from my understanding involves a big time commitment of going to the centers, you know, for a few days at a time, could any of kind of parent involvement be influenced, or the type of families who are bringing their child to do this study influence that? And I was just curious about where family structure involvement, like where parental involvement falls into some of this data.
Yeah. It's a good thought. Maybe we can follow that up. We keep trying to parse this puzzle. So to remind everyone, or if you joined late, this is the model that we tried to show. We tried to replicate my former postdoc's, or the postdoc in my lab, her prior paper, where she showed that people who are more at risk for an anxiety disorder, and this is in a community sample, remember, so the more at risk you were for an anxiety disorder, the more reading and math problems you'd have, and the more negative affectivity at age 2, which is the risk marker of later anxiety, the more reading and math problems you'd have, the more EF problems you have, and these were on the causal pathway. So if you had negative affectivity and then you had more executive function problems, you'd have more reading and math problems. So we tried to replicate that in this much larger sample of 2,800 kids. But these 2,800 kids, like you said, are referred. So I asked them, I work very closely with them. So I said, Lindsay, can you pull out for me all the kids in Healthy Brain Network who have no diagnosis and who came to Help Science? There was no parent referral question. There's like 150 kids out of 7,000. The kids are coming because Their parents are worried about them. And early on when I met with Mike, he was like, also, can you design for me what we should give to measure learning? And can you tell me how to get kids to come, because no one's coming? And I was like, well, here's how you get kids to come. You give them a free neuropsych. Because that's what we were doing in my study that I showed you. And then he said, okay, I'll do that, but you got to train my team. So we did. So basically, when you come to do the Healthy Brain Network study, you commit to doing the experiments, like getting in the scanner, doing EEG, but you also do all the tasks that we need for this, what we call deep phenotyping, like really understanding your reading, writing, math, psychiatric functioning, social functioning, parent express, all this stuff. And then they get a report at the end. So yes, this is an unusual population. It's what we call in epidemiology a psychiatrically weighted sample of the community. It's a sample of psychiatrically challenged children. It's also much better weighted toward the census ethnically, racially, and socioeconomically than Jun's study was. It's still not perfect. So in one of the studies I published, the first prevalence estimate of nonverbal learning disability, one of the samples we used was Healthy Brain, and we did some fancy propensity score weighting to make the number of people match the census of youth in New York City. So it isn't perfect in terms of who comes. But we did control for socioeconomic status in this study, and we controlled for, what else? Sex, and we controlled for ADHD symptoms, because, as I said, 80% of the kids in Healthy Brain Network have an ADHD diagnosis. So given all of that, well, how the heck do we make sense of this, right? That's what I'm really wrestling with. And I think our answer is close to your answer, that we're not looking at a typically developing community sample. We're looking at a group of kids who have anxiety and other mental health problems. And this relationship between negative affect and executive function is pretty normal in people who have anxiety disorders. So that was this whole business I told you about, someone riding their bike in the bike lane. And if they're an anxious person, they may be very anxious about going over the line and going out of the bike lane. And then if they have high executive functions, their anxiety about going over to the bike lane is going to also make them attend to the bike lane a lot. And that is going to put them at greater risk for having the anxiety disorder or the impairment associated with the anxious feeling. And so I'm not surprised by this in this particular sample. And this is what you'd expect: better executive functions, better reading. The question is, what do we do about it, right? And you might be right. We have tried slicing it up by different kinds of affect, different kinds of executive function. Nothing changed this story. But maybe parenting would. And we do in Healthy Brain Network have the Alabama parenting scale. So tomorrow, Christy could run that. I'll let you know. I mean, I'm really trying to understand this. Like, it would be nice to separate this into two groups so that there is a group where, you would think this is a negative relationship, or this. You want more negative affect to go with lower reading skills, and less negative affect to go with better reading skills. So if that's not the case and these data are correct and this is the model, then we just need to start understanding. So our kids who have more executive functions that will help them more with their reading, they're also going to be feeling worse. Maybe we just need to know those are the kids you need to take the most care of in terms of their psychiatric function when they're in your classroom. Maybe those are the kids who your teacher today said, it's correct. Just tell me, now, your answer is right. I'm wondering why you did it, how you decided to do it so that your peers could learn, right? If you explain that process and someone's anxiety comes down, maybe that's this kid. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
As best I can. What's really great about this data set is we have brain function, right? So it's not just the behavior data. These 2,800 kids, we have their brains. Well, we don't have their actual brains. We have pictures of their brains.
Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate everybody, and just want to say a big thank you to Amy for the incredible presentation tonight. Big round of applause, please. Again, just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us here live and in person at the Manhattan campus, and a big thank you to those at home. We really appreciate the support as we engage in this process, and I hope you walked away learning a little bit. Every time we talk, Amy, I feel like I get more and more excited about what you're doing, the world around us, and all the possibilities. I just love your curiosity, I love your passion, I love your energy, so thank you so much for that. And I hope you all have a great night, and again, thanks for being here. Have a good night.